Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Observable Flutter. My name is Craig Labenz, and I'm your host. And today, I've got yet another repeat guest coming on to tell us about version 2 of their really exciting package that I personally really love, really believe in philosophically. So I'm excited to find out what changes are landing in version 2.0. I don't know what is coming yet. I don't know how Mix is evolving. So I'll be finding out with the rest of you, which I'm very excited about. But before we get too far into that, do recall that this is the Flutter community. We all know what that means. All right. Yes, today's guest, you'll recognize him from his past appearance on Observable Flutter, his great work as a Flutter GDE, and just all around being an awesome dude. Leo Farias. Leo, welcome back to Observable Flutter. First of all, Leo, did I pronounce your last name correctly? As I was saying it, I realized I didn't know. But other than that, would you like to say a few words to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks for introduction. It's nice to be back. I think it's great to have an opportunity to share the things we've been working on with the community. Yeah, for everyone that doesn't know, I think Craig's introduction was great, humbling. But yeah, so I'm Leo Farias. I'm a GDE for Dart and Flutter, and also CEO, founder of a company called Concepta, an agency, and we have a labs piece of the agency that we call Bitwild, and that we have been exploring a lot of these ideas around UI, GenUI, and this is a part where Mix comes from in some of our other projects. So it comes from the labs, is currently being used to tackle bigger problems that we have in mind for the future UI, and that we think that Flutter is a great fit for.
Well, that's a big tease for me as well in an exciting way, because obviously Google is really focused on Gen UI right now. We've been given folks on the Flutter team, especially Andrew Brogdon, has been giving a lot of talks about Gen UI. It's I think, a pretty interesting area of research. And if as an industry, we can all stick the landing on how to actually really lean into Gen UI without allowing it to create terrible user experience kind
Yes.
of flows for end users, then it represents, I think, the first really big possible change to app paradigm, probably since the App Store, which was a massive exponential growth in the amount of UI you could have on your phone. And Gen UI is like the first similar growth since then, which is a thought I just had, and I don't really know if it makes sense or is true, but that's how it strikes me right now as I'm saying this. So I can't wait to
Yeah.
hear what Gen UI stuff you're working on, and you've teased to me that Mix has a lot of Gen UI things up its sleeves as well. So yeah, I'm really excited.
Yeah, I think GenUI is definitely a new. Um, I want to say like it's a new feature. I've been doing some talks about GenUI for a little bit over 2 years, and even explore this case. And I think the biggest challenge, like you talked about, is having that dependability and consistency, being deterministic, and also making sure that it allows for the human in the loop approach or the collaboration approach. So that's an area that's the most focus. Is not having AI do things by itself, but having a collaboration and how we interact with the UI in order to solve some of these common problems.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, exactly that. So you are the creator of the package Mix, which is on the cover of it's on the thumbnail for this video. And I realized as I was walking my dog this morning, I probably should have put
Mhm.
2.0 on that thumbnail to highlight that this is coverage of a major revision. I failed to do that because I have a smooth brain. But nonetheless, this is a stream about the big 2.0 release for Mix. So before we get into how to use Mix and what it is, and then obviously we'll probably tease as we explore it, like what is actually different. It's like, oh, this thing that we're looking at is new to 2.0 and wasn't in 1.0.
Mhm.
Before we get into any of that, why don't you help folks who are maybe not acquainted with Mix just get an expectation of what it is, why it exists, what kind of problem it solves, how it differs from other solutions that the Flutter ecosystem has to those same problems. What's your sales pitch for Mix?
Yeah, so Mix comes, and I always like to reference actually a video, Greg, that you did that I think is the video about theme extensions that you can find on YouTube, which uh, talking about what type of problems the theme extension try to use. And the analogy that you used is that sometimes Flutter can still feel like the old days of HTML, right? Where you have styling semantics being added together with business logic, right? And one thing that becomes difficult is that not only widgets, they tend to grow and they can become complicated, meaning that also we cannot always reuse the styling. It's not always clear how to use the styling. With material is great because material is like a first class citizen and it's well thought out and implemented. And with a lot of companies trying to bring their own design systems into it, and even Flutter now making a move to separate those things to make Flutter more friendly to, let's say, custom design systems, those things become a lot more difficult to keep it consistent there. And a few things, and I think everyone that has done any type of code review or seen code changes on a commit or PR, is that sometimes you have people that they add a padding to a widget online, right? So like, oh, I just want to add some padding, so they go ahead and wrap with the padding widget. And if you look at the diff on GitHub, it looks like there was a complete refactor on the code, right? And some of the challenges is that Flutter is great because it allows for that composability on the widget tree. But what Mix allows us to do is bring some of the concepts that we have and abstractions that we have on other technologies. Things from obviously from CSS. People made references to things like tailwinds. However, I think CSS is a more correct description because it's an abstraction of the styling. But also we are bringing some of these concepts from also Swift UI, how we handle animations and some of the challenges. And one thing we found out is that a lot of the things that Flutter does, it works really well. And I think it's even more equipped to solve some of these UI challenges that Swift UI does. And what it allows us to do by having essentially a CSS or styling abstraction, first, it allows us to define visual semantics outside of the widget tree and reuse. And that solves two problems. First, we can really separate styling from business logic, but also it allows us to have complete control over composability of the styling, how we are reusing the styling, how we are merging styles, how we are overriding styles in order to build very robust design systems. And one way to talk about Mix is that, and hopefully we get a little bit into it, is that it's not meant to be just one way as far as replacing how Flutter does things. We can use very little of it as far as like defining semantics. It has a good way to start implement it, but it is a Flutter styling system, right? So it does allow for a lot of different features we're gonna touch on in order to do that. But I think that's the main benefit, is the abstraction of the styling semantics outside of the widget tree or the business logic.
Yeah, that deeply resonates with me as a longtime full stack developer when I was in the web before I got into Flutter specifically. And I bet if we were to go back in the archives, the last time you were on Observable Flutter, I may have gone on this same rant that I'm about to go on. But the CSS gets kind of a bad name. A lot of front-end developers proclaim that they don't like CSS. And I think a lot of Flutter developers, when they're new, especially if they come from the web, are in the immediate term happy to see nothing that resembles CSS. And I think that this is a mistake on many levels, which is why I love Mix. But my pitch to the world on why I think 2 out of the 3 letters of CSS are really great, and it's the style sheet part. The cascading part is my personal opinion why people find that they don't like CSS. It's the old Spider-Man line, with great power comes great responsibility, and that cascading aspect of CSS is so unbelievably powerful that people find that they don't really know how to interact with the CSS they wrote yesterday, because they don't really remember the way it's going to cascade. Yesterday, it was all loaded in your head. Totally understood it. Today, you continue working on the UI, and it's like, what is this CSS? So that's not great. And in my opinion, that's where a lot of the frustration with CSS comes from. But Mix is almost like, you use the word merge. There is no cascading in Mix, at least not to the level of CSS. But there's lots of merging and the composability and whatnot. And CSS actually doesn't really have a ton of composability. You just you overwrite some rules. I guess maybe you'd call that composability, but it's it'd be confusing the way you order the classes and whatnot. I wouldn't call that one of CSS strengths. But Mix still delivers on that complete separation of semantics and styling. So, your semantics would just be plain old widgets, some text, some buttons, some links, some whatevers. And then how it looks is totally separate, like not found in the file with the semantic information. And that idea, which was the core idea of CSS, is just such a good one. And I love Mix's quest to fully return that to Flutter. So that's my rant as a CSS lover, though I have mixed feelings about the cascading part. How does that hit you? Does that resonate with your feeling about things?
Yes, and to be honest, I'll say that there's 2 parts of, I think, CSS when I approach, right? There's this conceptual parts, and I think there's the dev experience piece, which I think you're touching on. And so one thing is to take inspiration from CSS, meaning, hey, let's have the style sheets, let's define it, let's have the style, be able to respond to context, right? Like media query, resizing responsive, or if its brightness is on or off, and things like that. But also, I think the challenge with CSS is that where we want to do a mix is that, okay, but we want also a typed experience, right? We want all this to be easily to be able to analyze the code, and also simplify where we can through things like, which we're going to touch on, like code generation and so on. So I think it's not just, okay, let's have CSS, because I have to say that, there's many tailwinds that was already a response to, some of the challenges of CSS. And I mean, we have many different solutions, right? And I think that the biggest challenge becomes of the developer experience and the typed experience, right? Understanding it. And even touching on some of these things that we are doing for 2.0 from the feedback, is the challenge is there's a lot of decisions that comes with Flutter. How do we make sure that we keep the semantics somewhat aligned, right? So for example, things like a box decoration, like border radius and borders and how the borders work. So everyone can use it, but also we still improve upon. And I think that's the biggest challenge, right? Because one thing that we want to do with Mix is that we wanted to provide all these things and these features. But for example, if I'm aware of a widget tree, I can navigate the Mix API for the styling, right? And that was always a very difficult balancing act of saying, okay, because essentially we're inheriting all the decisions from Flutter, and we always want to separate, right? We want to build upon what is there without having also to get into decisions that were made before, which we are not always aware of, right? So that was, I think, the biggest challenge that we had with 2.0 is a lot of that semantic and navigating the API to resemble also Flutter. And the good thing also is that Mix 2.0 was built for the short dot notation, right? Meaning that a lot of the decisions we made, it was done with this in mind, right? For us to get to a point that we have a syntax that feels very clean, it looks easy to read, and then allows us to build upon that. So another big change of Mix 2.0 is that, okay, how do we optimize the whole style sheet, if you will, to be easy to read and to work with the shorthand notation for it. And I think we'll be able to accomplish that, and it works really well.
Yeah, you mentioned to me months ago, I think it was months ago, that you were going to really lean into dot shorthands in this, and I don't even know what that looks like yet. I'm really excited to see it. There's a couple of interesting comments in the chat, and I want to talk about these, and then maybe we can pull up some code and start mixing some styles into some widgets. First one from Electric Cookie. I'm not going to click on it because you used a bad word, but you also had a great thought. It said, if I have a row widget, it carries semantics and style. And there's definitely some real truth to that. I mean, probably the descendants of the children of the row widget actually have the semantics, but there's some style in the row widget for sure, because it implies layout, and layout is, it's kind of hybrid. The information architecture is layout, and that's semantics, but it's also style, how things are positioned. And so I think that I just wanted to point out that is a fair point, that like there is some gray area, and I think of layout as kind of a gray area. So you do have widgets in Flutter that are purely layout widgets, obviously. So that's a great point. Before I go on to the next one, do you have any thoughts on that exact kind of nugget?
Yeah, so I think so it touches on some of the challenges that we addressed, that because yes, that definitely layouts and one thing. So for example, I think the killer feature for Flutter will be a flex container, right? So essentially having normally when you create a flex layout, you also want to be able to wrap around where it could be a container. So there are two pieces, right? Because you always have the styling piece and also the layouts, right? And that was also a balancing act, because once we start removing all the layout things from Mix, then it became of kind of like this weird in between that we're not able to solve. So in order to do that, one thing that we've done on Mix is to create something like a flex box, right? Which essentially will be a flex and a container together. But I'll add to the comments, and I'll add another challenge, which is you have something like the row, and you can have a container, but also depending how you want to relay out, you have a flexible widget, expand, and so on, right? So you have almost this 3-level piece that they come together in order to define how they lay out. So one thing that we wanted to do with Mix is that allows us to do that. So for example, in Mix one, when I create a style, I can actually add things to the widget tree itself, right? So I can actually, so for example, let's say I create a box. I can actually say wrap with an opacity on it and wrap with other widgets, right? So essentially, it allows us to actually build a widget tree just from the styling, right? So that's one thing that we had to do in order to do things like, for example, like aspect ratio, or if you wanted to do, other types of margins in attacks and so on, you want to wrap it, you want to use a box. So there's a lot of these things that come together, and I'll be showing a lot of the examples through the documentation and so on, because I think it allows to more clearly see and compare and define what they might look like. And we have some, I think, good examples of them there also.
All right, last thought from also Electric Cookie, throwing down some really interesting food for thought here. Electric Cookie says, I love the fact that I can read a build method and understand everything in line. And there's some, this is on a follow-up to their comment about how a row widget carries semantics and style. And I think they're bringing a counter opinion to this conversation about separating semantics and styling not necessarily being the greatest thing in the world. But I would point out here that, you know, if you have a container widget and you pass a couple parameters into it, you can't read everything in that moment. Like the container build method is long and it's doing a lot of this kind of stuff Leo was just saying. Like if you pass in a box decoration to the container widget, like it wraps that with something. If you pass in a color, it wraps it in a colored box. And so like all the pieces of what's going on in Flutter are already spread out forever. And if you're not passing in a theme yourself, like that theme is defined somewhere else. And even if you didn't define a theme, there's a default theme that's defined somewhere else. So it is already pretty fragmented.
And also, I think is this, for example, if you have just a container, so for example, a container is already very, let's say, robust widget. So if anyone looks at the source code of the container, pretty much is you know, a more user-friendly API for widget tree, opacity, paddings, margins, right, color box, and everything else. So if the example is having a simple container and you want the background color blue and a padding and a margin and a border, then, you know, I do agree that those things become a lot clearer. The challenge becomes, which you're going to have the example, is when you have styling that reacts to context, right? So for example, when you want things to behave differently, if I tap on it, if I press on it, if I hover it, or because now it means that I have to create states and manage states just for the sake of styling, right? And that's one thing that Mix also allows us to do is define the styling and how the styling reacts to context, context changes. So things become a lot cleaner. So you can have actually a reactive style being defined outside of it.
All right. Leo, I see that your screen is in the lobby. Are you ready to start actually looking at Mix?
Yes.
All right. Well, the stage is yours. So give us the tour here.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's I think we touched on a lot of the things that we wanted to do with Mix, but I want to showcase
real quick, by the way, Leo.
Go ahead.
The text is not terribly readable, and we've got big. I think you're sharing a very wide screen, like a wide aspect ratio screen right now.
Okay.
So if you're sharing like your browser window, maybe shrinking it or something, and then a little Command ++ would be good.
Okay, could I just share the window itself real quick?
Yeah, if you're sharing your whole, I also have a wide monitor that doesn't lend itself to being shared in a video.
Okay.
Folks, I see some questions coming in about how Mix handles specific things. Like I just started that question, Rahul. Keep asking questions. I'm going to star them and get to them either all at the end or like intersperse when we get to a specific topic and it's appropriate. So keep the questions coming. They're not being ignored. Okay, Leo, back to you.
Yeah, so here's just people that haven't been familiar with it. But one thing that we do with Mix is, and that's what resembles, if you will, CSS, but essentially we're defining the style. So this is a very basic approach for it. So essentially I'm doing styling for a box and I'm defining the color, padding, and so on. Here's a comparison that I think it's a good way to illustrate Mix. So let me actually show here a custom widgets, okay, that we are defining, and we actually try to be fair with the code. Of course, there's always like, abstractions and things like that we can build, but I think everyone has seen similar code to something like this, right? So essentially is I have a widget that I want to based on things like hover, right? I can go ahead and implement it, and I can have material. And essentially, I want to have a animation that works on, and it's changing completely as you go through, right? So a couple of things to highlight here is when we do on hover, we actually have to go and say which properties we want to react to this, right? And also when you're getting the theme, we're getting the theme from the context, right? So it has a lot of different pieces here. So the same code on mix will look something like this, right? So one thing that I can see is that when I create a style here, for example, I can actually say how I want to animate it there. And I can say, and these are, let's say, context variants, right? So I can say, I want to define this, but when it's on dark, I want to override this color here, right? And also when it's hovered, I want to go ahead and animate this way. And then if hover is on light, I want to change this color also, right?
All
So
right, so I
there's a
have
lot of,
an immediate question here. I there's something about a couple of these lines that is different than like my immediate interpretation. So the on dark, you're setting the color to black. Like I would have expected on dark to set the color to white, and on light I would have expected to set the color to black. So can you clear up my confusion there?
yeah, so this is just an example here. So if you, for example, if you see down dark of the box itself, we have a gray color. So yeah, that's probably like we can make the example a little bit clearer. But yeah,
I
the
see.
goal is just we want to have a styling that is different on dark versus on light. So there's a change in between. But yeah, I think that to your point, so we can probably adjust this to make it a little bit easier to understand. Um, but one thing you can see here that essentially we define the custom styling and we define the box itself, right? And one thing we can go ahead and do is pass the custom box style, right? In the style text with the styling itself, okay? So essentially is all this that we had to do here can be done here, and of course here as far as we define as part of the widget, but we can actually define it outside of the widgets in a separate file and be able to reuse it throughout. Okay, so this is I think a comparison of how we can reference things and reuse it, and all the different pieces that I think become important when we are defining styling. um, the one thing that is we're able to do that, what we call like utility first approach. So the main goal here is for us to have these styling features again that can be defined, right? And one thing you can see, we kind of separate it to just understand the API itself with dot notation. Obviously, these things become much clearer. But one thing we had to do in order to accommodate for what we want to mix is essentially we create a mix variant of classes that exist, right? So for example, the edge insets geometry, everyone is familiar with it. We have a similar API, but we had to create a mixed one. And the reason is because, for example, everything is mergeable and you can override everything, right? So a lot of the classes within Flutter set defaults, right? So if I do a border, for example, it will set a default to black with a certain width. And what we want is essentially is that everything is optional. We're going to go ahead and merge and do all the overrides and then resolve to an edge insets geometry, for example, right? So it allows us to essentially, we have aliases, but you can see that essentially that's what it's doing, right? It's doing when it's doing border all, it's saying, okay, I want the border with the red, and pretty much everything is optional until we go ahead and resolve it, right? Yeah, so I don't know if you have any questions or want to touch on specific pieces here, and we can go through the guides after if it makes sense.
Um, no, I mean I'm certainly following. Let me look at some of the Yeah, let me look at some of these starred questions I have, see if any of them are. I think the questions right now are still more detailed than we've gotten so far. So they would, I think they'll be more appropriate in a couple minutes. So yeah, I'd say let's keep going.
Mhm. Yeah, so here's an example of styling with mix and kind of seeing how the styling is separated from the widget tree, right? So here we have an example of how we define a style in mix, okay? And this is an example of how we can start to compose these things and reuse, right? So here we can define a base style. And what we do is, if you want to create a variant of it, we can just define it by overriding the value, right? So essentially you have a value and we say, okay, it's color blue, now it becomes solid. We can do a soft version of it. So it becomes easy for us to have a style and override the style and actually compose many styles and overrides through it. And this becomes a very powerful feature. For example, you want it rounded corners and you always want the same rounded corners, or you have font sizes and so on, and you want that consistency that goes through. You can always have a foundational a piece that will allow us to kind of dig deep, if you will, on it. And allowing for things like this, right? So the dynamic and context-aware styling that we talked about, where when it's on hovered, I can override. So one way to think about it is that essentially we are defining a style. And what we're saying is that when you do the on hovered, is we're essentially doing something like this, right? We're doing something like this here, but it only happens when you do on hover. We merge the overrides, right? So you're overriding on the on hover and on dark, and when that happens, it just reacts to the context itself. So that becomes a lot cleaner implementation, and it means that we completely separate the styling semantics from the behavior. So, for example, if a widget has a lot of states to just manage styling, it kind of can become a little bit difficult for us to browse and go through it.
So a question about this unhovered decorator, right? It's not really a decorator, but the function. Obviously, hovered state requires a mouse region widget. There's other focus. There's probably a non-focus that requires like a focus tree, focus node in the focus tree. So one thing about how I'm aware of at least Mix 1, so correct me if this is not still true for Mix version 2, how Mix works is that you've got these styles and you use kind of Mix analogs to standard Flutter widgets. So instead of using a container, you use a box, and that's where you apply the box style. Now within the box widget of Mix, if my memory is correct, obviously Mix is turning all of these box style concepts, like they're in the end, they're still a container. Like a box uses a container, and it uses all the same other, or like probably many of the same other widgets. It's just kind of this more unopinionated way to declare how the container should behave. But part of that is, like, if you're going to have an on-hovered rule, you need a mouse region widget. So does that line there, like the third line of the bottom sample, on-hovered colors blue shade 700, does the existence of that line introduce a mouse region widget? I presume there's not always a mouse region widget in coming out of a box.
Yeah. So one thing that with them, especially because hover and a lot of the design system that we see kind of going web, right? So a web has a little bit of a different priorities, if you will, on things like how it's going to react to hover and so on. So it kind of goes back into let's say the CSS piece, right? So CSS has things that apply. So for example, any moments in any elements, I can kind of use a hover on an element itself. So what we do with Mix is essentially what you described, is if I do use on hover, right? And it can be within the tree. So for example, if I have a box that does on hover and I have another element that also does on hover, what it does is checks if there are any variants at the time that might need those things, right? And the main one that we need is the hover side of the mouse region, or we kind of played also with the listener side of the cursor things to get like an optimal implementation for it. But pretty much it says, okay, do we have any variants that we need to add this in order to track? And then if we do, we actually check if already exists in the tree or not. And again, this is pretty much we're doing just context, right? Like, does this provider exist in the tree, right? And if not, we wrap the widget with it, and that can work extremely well. And that's one of the assumptions that we have to make. But yeah, we have to wrap within this widget to do something like the hover.
Yeah.
And now,
oh, sorry, keep going.
no, and I'll actually touch on something like the widget modifiers, because I think it kind of builds upon this concept, right? So, for example, if I have a box widget and I want to go ahead and add an opacity to it. So this is a bit of the thoughts and a lot of the feedback that we and kind of use in production. The people that have been building design systems using Mix, we kind of had many conversations and getting feedback. And is, for example, we can have the box styler and actually try to create a new API, right? So pretty much anything they want to put on a widget tree, we can just have these utility methods that allows us to do that. But we wanted to keep it semantically consistent, right? So we wanted to be explicit on what you're doing. So the main goal is that we have a few shortcuts for box styler. For example, box styler size here is essentially the width and height, right? An easy way to do that. And what we do here is the wrap. It means that I'm wrapping this box with an opacity widget, right? So we actually have a separate API and kind of building on the dot short notation, because we want to make sure that those things are very explicit on how we build. And this essentially generates something like this here, right? So essentially it's going to render an opacity with the container within. And there's a lot of different ones that we talked about. Even things like flexible, transform, visibility, clip rect, and padding. All these things that sometimes you have to kind of go into the tree, but they're not critical for behavior and always critical for layout. They're more of a decoration that you're building upon. So for us, it was important to make sure that we have some of these examples here, right? So essentially can wrap opacity, padding. And one of the changes that we already made for the next release is I can have wrap only once and actually just define within the same wrap all the opacity, padding, and so on, right? Align. So you don't have to redefine wrap, right? Everything is pretty much nested within the dot notation. But I think there's a good example of how we can build upon this. Even things like, obviously the box has a padding itself, but sometimes you want to put another padding outside the margin, depending on how you're building upon. So as an example, right, the alignment center as more of an illustration on some of these things that can be done and how they work. So it gives complete access to its own to the widget tree. And a good thing that we worked with teams on is that sometimes they want to build their own widget modifiers. So we do also allow to build this. And the interesting thing is that if you look at the code of a widget modifier, there's some interface and signature things. But just to make sure that we can animate through it, we just create an API that pretty much say, okay, we want to do a copy with, we want to do a lerp, similar to a theme extension, right? So it's very similar to a theme extension, how we're doing this. And you can see the build here saying, okay, you're going to accept the child and you're going to render it. So building a modifier like this, it becomes very simple and people can customize and so on in order to create decoration. Because that's one thing that was important for us, is that how can we make sure that can we support other packages, right? How can we support
extensibility?
what are some other things that are out there that we can build upon? Because a lot of the things that Flutter does or other packages, they also are wrapping the widget tree, right, in order to work.
Yeah, this seems really smart. I love that this ends in a build method that just unlocks total freedom and creativity for somebody kind of encoding their own encoding their own apps branded styles with Mix, and then capturing the really unique edge cases with these custom modifiers that just end in a build method. And there's a couple, I think, questions that the time has arrived to get to. And we're seeing, well, I think some of these, the answers, so this question goes back 10 minutes, but I think the answer has become more clear since then. I clicked on the wrong question from the same person, although this question I think is also becoming more clear, what problem Mix solves. But Saman, a few minutes later, asked, so it, and I think is like Mix in this box style we were looking at when this question came in, is like having a static box decoration to reuse throughout the UI. I would venture an answer to that, but of course, Leo, you should answer this question.
So, what problem? Maybe is the question more about the highest level problem or challenge that Mix solves, or
sorry,
a comparison?
I clicked on the wrong one. I just want to focus on this question and asking. So I think this person, Swan, is trying to just map what they're seeing on the stream right now to standard Flutter stuff that they maybe already understand. And they're wondering, so like these styles, what would be the closest way to approximate these concepts without using the Mix package? And they're wondering, like, would I be getting, am I kind of in the same ballpark if I had a static box decoration and I started to reuse it everywhere? And there's limitations to that. I don't think it would be as mergeable. It wouldn't be as unopinionated. It wouldn't have modifier stuff built in. But in my mind, like, yes, that would move you in this same kind of conceptual direction. But Mix is like the logical conclusion of that quest. Like apply that idea to all the things. Does that resonate with you, Leo?
Yeah. So for example, there are cases that, of course, for example, you can always create, if you have a black box with rounded corners and so on, you can define it only once and reuse it everywhere, right? So in many ways, I think that resolves the problem. The reason is not exactly like a static. Well, I'll say it like this. It is similar to a box decoration, like a static, or define, let's say, a global variable, right? Or like people sometimes do, they just define these almost like design tokens, if you will, right? That they just kind of bring in and reuse. The reason is a little bit different is that it needs to react to context, right? So once we get into some of these more advanced features, obviously like the directives and the dynamic styling and animations, I think they might become a little clearer. But for example, some of the one thing that Mix does is we need to be able to define values, right, outside of the build context, right? So similar to how the variants work, like on Dark, is that we're defining that, but we're not hard coding, right? It's almost like we have a if conditional. Similar way is that you had to create a function that accepts a build context, so you can check the brightness and do the conditional within, and you call the function within the build method, passing the build context, right? So one of the things that Mix allows to do is to essentially define all these things outside of it and how they react to the context itself. So I think there is a problem that can be easily solved by having a static box decoration there. Now, we go beyond that, not only with the context, but also defining a lot of the elements of the widget tree when it comes to styling, right, through the modifiers. And that's one thing I want to be clear to everyone, is that Mix is not meant to so for example, if you're using material and you're happy with material and it works really well, it's not like, okay, use mix because it's going to be better in certain situations. Mix was initially made for the design system problem. The design system problem is that you're going to have many elements that have consistent throughout borders, spacing, font sizes throughout. We want to keep maintainability really easy, and we want to also separate things like the widget tree and how we compose, right? So essentially, you have a tool set of styling, and between themselves, they're all consistent, right? They all are aligned, but also you can build upon them or modifying them without impacting a lot of the business logic that being upon. So there's definitely like a overlap there, but I think it builds upon a more within. Is if you could define outside and have the build context, then I think it'll be a great comparison, if you will.
Yeah, yeah, it totally does. I love that phrasing or framing of mix being a design system level solution. Like material is a design system. But if you don't want material, then obviously that's been a source of friction for Flutter developers for however many years now. And so, yes, mix is like a way to build your own design system, use it really coherently in your app. And also the point about needing the build context to get that dynamicism. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. If you had a static box decoration sitting, ready and waiting, you would probably in your build method where you wanted to use it have to examine the build context and then like run some copy widths to to respond to maybe different media query sizes or light mode, dark mode things, whatnot. So mix is just combining all of that in the very first place. So that all definitely makes sense to me. Okay, I'm continuing to follow along with questions here, but I think we're ready to continue.
Yeah, so I think one example I'll mention here is let me pull up here the dynamic style. So sorry, there's some background noise.
It's all right. Lumps and mashed potatoes are how everybody knows that food is homemade. So a little background noise hasn't killed anybody.
So here's so for example, the style here, the example here with the hover states, right? That we have there with the variants, if you will, how they work together. And I want to also showcase here a lot of these, and also we can build our own variants. It becomes very easy for you to just create these variants that you can reuse. But this is some of the built-in variants. So you can see here, have things like on hovered, on pressed, on focused, disabled, and then you have like things like on landscape, on portrait, right? So we try to really build in on some of these things. So for example, for you to do something like on portrait, on landscape, we're always doing like these build context extension methods, right? To have like easy conditional that we can build, but we still have to build that conditional, right? So it allows us to pretty much do these checks, and you can also build upon the breaking points, and then we have like some predefined ones like on mobile, on tablet, on desktop, and you can see here even things like on Android, on iOS. So it allows us to actually define all these overrides, if you will. And there's an example here, which is a tool, which is on not, which it's great because it pretty much is, sometimes we want to have like a negative conditional, right? So it allows us to do that also. But also we have our own builder. And the own builder is, I think it kind of helps do that because, or build upon this, is that we can actually pass the build context. You define it outside of the widget tree, and you can actually pass the context to in order to resolve it and build your own variants, if you will.
Interesting. Randall just said, oh, you could build styles like on admin screen. And I'm not sure if Randall's imagining like, checking your routing library of choice to figure out if the user is on the admin screen, but I suppose there is a, once you've got the build context, there is a lot of wide open possibility there.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's see if there. So one question that folks are getting at here, and I think is maybe good to get at right now, is like the relationship between this and Flutter theme. So a recent question I think summarizes it nicely, and the answer to this question will probably touch on all of it. So would you recommend Mix as a full replacement for theme data, or should they coexist? And I have wondered this myself in moments using Mix, so I'm curious how you see and think about this, Leo.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so I wouldn't. So, for example, theme data kind of goes into the material side of things. So, for example, I think this might change a bit as far as maybe Craig, you can talk more about some of these things that are happening as far as material and Cupertino and separating. But theme data is always associated historically with things like material. So you can use things still with theme data in works. I think is that if, for example, if you have a system that you're using and everything is configured through theme data and you're using components that use the theme data, I think I'd be lying to you to say like, okay, go ahead and replace it, right? Now, of course, I think Mix solves some things that they're interesting as far as the semantics outside, but I won't say just replace it for the sake of replacing it. I think it becomes a little bit challenging because it depends on how well you're using theme data in a way. Because a lot of the sometimes what I see, and I think some people might see similar things, where there's this weird mix of theme data and also maybe some like custom widgets with overrides and maybe some tokens that are defined globally and they get kind of mixed in between, right? So with Mix, you don't need theme data. I think that's one of the ways I'll respond to that way to think about it. But I think it becomes difficult saying, hey, if I have theme data and it's working really well, should I replace it? I think the answer is probably not.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think if you've got a big app already, it's probably going to be quite painful to rip out any mention of theme data. But if you're starting a brand new code base and you've just run Flutter Create, then you probably could think about using a widgets app and not really using theme data. Of course, even if you use a material app and you just only use box widgets, or sorry, you use box and other mix widgets, then none of your widgets will look up the theme and you won't be using it. Yeah, that makes sense. Also, in part of the breakout, I've fallen a little bit behind on the latest evolution of the material in Cupertino decoupling from the actual framework. But I believe, and I know I'm on the team, so you'd like things that I say to be extremely trustworthy, but you'll have to take this one with a grain of salt because it's been a few weeks since I've gotten any updates, which is my fault, not theirs. I believe the plan is to introduce something like themes into the widgets layer, because a lot of Flutter developers are pretty surprised over the years when they discover that themes are only in material and there's not even an agnostic theme in the widgets layer. And I believe that is going to change as part of this decoupling effort. So in that world, even once you're using a widgets app, you'd still need to think about, if you use some non-mix widgets and you use core framework widgets, like they might look up that default theme provided by the widgets library. And then you need to just kind of juggle when a widget in your widget tree is like getting styles from this other place versus when it's getting it from the mix styles that you've defined.
Yeah, I think also one thing I want to, and I don't know if, let me know if that's getting too much into this, but I want to try to give a little bit like behind the scenes, if you will, of some of these things like the context variants that we talked about. So for example, here's, let's say I have so people can understand how these things can be customized and defined. So for example, let's say if you have an inherited widget that you want to track a particular flag or value that is there, right? So very simple widget. So you just track like true or false. So one thing that Mix allows us to do is actually go through and again, the code here is verbose, but if you can define it here, we're going to walk through how creating like a cleaner API, if you will. But it actually allows us to create a context variance. And you can see that pretty much we define like an identifier. And this identifier is just used for the sake of how we do things like merges and overrides. But you can see that all we have to do here, and the code could be much simpler to just return it, but we're just getting the flag from the context and returning, right? So that's pretty much what we're doing here. And this is an example of how this on custom flag works. So we have these mixins that our widgets use. So we can actually build the widget state mix in there and so be able to create something like this, right? So we can actually go through and say, okay, on custom flag, we can change the color to blue. So that's because I think that when people see it, they're like, okay, what's happening behind the scenes? But in a way, what we're doing is almost just creating these builders that are going to be resolved on build time, right? That's pretty much what we're doing, and allows us to have control over what the context does and when it needs to go through it and create overrides. And I think that kind of sees that, we want to have a very clean API, but even if we want to do, let's say, a custom like variants, you can see that, okay, now you're interacting with build context and things like that, right? But the difference is that we're only resolving them later. Does that make sense?
It does. And this feature really strikes me as delivering the same kind of thing as just CSS's flexibility on custom classes, right? You could have a like selected class or something, right? In CSS, it's very easy to then write some CSS dot selected and you give it a background color, you bold the text or whatever, right? And then let's say you're using React DOM, and in the components render method, you check some application state and you either apply dot selected or not. And that's just really clean. It works really well. And this feels like it is how a Flutter developer using Mix would kind of get that same flexibility. Am I following the plot here? You are muted, Leo.
Oh, sorry. It's like you talked about the style sheet, right? So the API is the style sheet, but everything, as you can see, like when you're doing the modifier, hey, you're just saying you're gonna return widgets, and you're just saying, okay, how should these animate and return the values there? Similar to what we do with theme extensions, right? And you're doing the variant, the styling. How do we go ahead and handle these things, right? So I think that becomes very important to say, okay, you have an API that, semantically we want to follow something like Flutter, but it doesn't look how Flutter normally defines styling. But you can see that all these utilities and things like that, behind the scenes, they are just like, normal Flutter code, build context, build methods behind the scenes, right?
Yeah. Yep. Okay, taking another scan of the starred questions, seeing if any are right for right now. Some folks have asked interesting questions about kind of higher level Flutter stuff, like some more interesting stuff about the decoupling project, the philosophy behind it. I'm gonna talk about those things at the end. I don't want to have a long detour from Mix here, but folks curious about the decoupling effort, I'm not ignoring you, and we're going to get to those. Okay, Leo, I think we're ready to continue.
Okay, so another example here that I'll touch on is that, which is really powerful feature, but Every property can also have directives, and directives allow pretty much is transformation that will also happen on build time, right? So here's some examples of directives that we created for text, right? So for example, if I go ahead and on the style text, here's an example. If I create something like the text styler, I can actually do title case, font weight, bold, right? And examples like that. So actually, there are values that we can transform during the build side of things. Now, the reason this is interesting is that it kind of so maybe people start seeing a pattern, which is we want to bring all the things that are styling outside of business logic. And I think a lot of people have done things like, okay, make sure that this value that's returning from the API that render is going to be, capitalized, or, if the blog post is title case or whatever I need to modify. And how we start having like all these utilities that are transforming as part of the build method, doing things that are just styling, right? So now we have like a lot of the different abstractions in order to do those things, right? And that's, I think, an insight of some of these things that we do. The goal is that we also have properties that allow to be transformed during the build method. And we also have things similar to, as part of the 2.0, we have like a release candidate we want to simplify, but we actually building also part of the value things that, if I have a value, I want to go ahead and subtract or divide or clamp, also doing that. So essentially, as all these properties, we can have directives for them, if you will. And let me see if I can just, because we actually kind of go here. But this is an example of how to create a custom directive, if you will, also. So you can see here that pretty much we have, equality. Everyone knows that we have a key, right? But we also have like an apply method saying, hey, you're going to receive a value. What do you want to do with the value there, right? And what we do is that we build an extension on the text styler, okay? And then we can go ahead and just do something like this, text styler reverse, and actually we can reverse the value. So one of the things that I think goes into on 1.0, we're doing some things like that. But what we wanted to do is that give control over how people want to customize and implement and actually build upon some of the features that we do have, and also, again, allow to take advantage of, hey, we don't want mix to replicate a lot of things that other packages are doing really well, but how can I make sure that we can reuse those things? How can we have a story that allows for the type of interaction between? I think that becomes really important.
Yeah. So some of the, a couple questions have come in a second ago and earlier, and this part also feels like it really relates to that to me. So this directive is going to reverse the string of this, whatever the string is on every frame, right? It's going to just keep reversing the string every time this widget rebuilds, which is probably not a terrible cost, given that reversing a string is, unless it's a very, very long string, going to be pretty cheap. If you're rendering all of War and Peace and you put .reverse at the end and then you animate it, then you probably have a really bad time. Yeah. But your app probably doesn't do that. But this gestures, I think, at another topic here as we look at, like when I look at even just kind of material Flutter widgets and themes, and you crack open some of these build methods of widgets in the framework, you see a tremendous amount of theme surgery happening. There's tons of evaluation, especially with the new material state properties, which are also now widget state properties. So it's broken out of just the material layer, where there's a whole function that's passed in a bunch of states like hovered, pressed, focused, and then there's just a function to evaluate, okay, what should the color be for this? What should the font weight be? What should the whatever be? And, it's kind of dizzying to see the amount of code that is run to just figure out the styling values for a given frame. And it happens on every frame. And it is really dizzying. And that's vanilla Flutter. we're seeing a lot of the same stuff here, obviously, where you've got these styles and they're composable, and it's pretty clear that this is happening per frame. So given that the question, of course, is about the performance of this. Given that if someone has never heard of Mix and they're just using Flutter, there's already a lot of this going on. A lot of per frame, per widget computation to figure out styling values. Certainly a lot going on here as well. Have you measured kind of comparative performance? Like, is there a point where a Flutter app can just be spending a lot of time figuring out its mix values? What have you seen there?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, and I'll answer in two separate ways, right? Because I think there's always the potential. So, for example, there's a potential of better performance by not having those things, right? But also, when you have styling that is mixed with other states that don't represent it, you risk also rebuilding some of these stylings because of side effects of states that are not interacting directly with it. And what I mean by that is by having the styling layer separately, we can actually uh, be very um, opinionated about how we choose to not rebuild and how we cache these things, right? So, for example, a whole widget tree can rebuild, states can change, and a lot of things can happen, right? But if the style did not change, right? If the style did not change at all, there's no reason for us to rebuild that, right? So if the parameter is being passed into the style tag, in the case of the reverse, right? So if the string being passed into the style text did not change, and there are no changes to the style sheet, if you will, then it means that we are not rebuilding it, right? We're just caching. So actually, we are reusing the resolved values that they are already there. We're resolving all the pieces, and I think that kind of builds upon of, okay, there's a concern, but also there's an opportunity there, right? The opportunity is that we can actually treat styling semantics, how we treat it as part of the build method differently, because we know that these things are the styling semantics there, and we have a little bit more control. So that allows us to say, okay, if the styles are not changing, if the parameters are not changing, we can actually cache that. So it becomes very, the performance works really well. And to highlight that, maybe we can kind of get into animations, because I feel like animations is the ultimate test for a lot of these things, right? Because once you have
Absolutely.
performance issues, animations just become, I don't know, like the kryptonite in a way.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, that'd be great. And you don't have to answer this right now, but I'll also just pose the question to you. Do you have any documentation kind of guiding developers like, this way is good because it leans into the caching. Like this way of writing your styles and widgets and connecting them is bad because you'll accidentally bust the cache every frame no matter what. I haven't read all the V2 documentation, so I don't know if it's there, but that would be helpful. But I'd love to see the this animation stuff.
Yeah, so I think that's one thing that we can focus on. I think that will be important, and it does follow similar rules to, in a way, creating a guide for that becomes important. But another way to think about it is that, for example, if every frame you're switching a style in between, then you're gonna lose obviously some of that cache in between, right? So saying, okay, I want this styling here, and now if another frame changes, I want this styling, then obviously, and again, it's a very inexpensive piece because essentially we're just like merging lists. Is very inexpensive, but in a way is the equivalent of us doing that flag and passing new box decoration, if you will, right? Like that is gonna change. And another way is having variants that, for example, you have something like on Builder that they are heavy within themselves, right? But I think that does make sense for us to build upon of like what will be best practice. But in a way, you can think of it as if the styling is changing when you pass it to a box or style text and so on, then obviously it's going to change the parameter and it's going to change some things internally.
Yeah. All right, let's take a look at these animations. There have been a lot of questions earlier about animations as well. So as we move through this, I may bring some of them up if their questions are still unknown. If the answers to their questions are still unknown to us.
Okay, so there's animations, and I think that's one of the biggest things that came from Mix 1 to 2, which is animations within Mix means that you have to essentially like treat the styling outside of Mix in a way, right? And one thing that we did here is do things like, and I mentioned what will be the implicit animations, and implicit animations will be something like this. I just want essentially the animation to change, and you can imagine this is like within a build method. Okay, so I just want hey, when the state changes, I want to build the styling here, right? So as far as like this being expensive or not, all we're doing there is making sure is the equivalent of us having the counter on the set states and passing and creating the whole animation controller, or if you have a box, the animated container, and having the flag there with the animated container, right? That says, okay, I have an animated container, and I'm changing the width and the height based on the counter, right? So it's the same thing that happens there. And what we do with the animates is you can take like, this is an example of an animated container, okay? And you can see what it looks like here. And this is obviously running Flutter Web. And these things work really well because behind the scene, we're not doing a lot of things. And I invite everyone to check out if you have like things that are not clear as far as like, okay, concerns, it seems like there's some of it. Check out what happens there. So essentially is if a style has an animation, essentially we are creating an animated widget in a way in order to handle some of these things, okay? And then, and this is another way that we have to interact with, and we're still updating the documentation for a lot of the API to keep it consistent throughout. But one thing that we are exploring also is with this pattern, I'll just touch on quickly, which is I'm gonna define a style, but then I can actually use it as a widget. So using, which I love this feature in Darts, which is the callable methods. But essentially is the widget there, if I call it, is actually a widget itself and actually can pass a child itself. So I don't even have to define, let's say, a box widget to pass the style. I can just call the style and it becomes essentially a widget build method there, right? So here you can see I have the animate spring, and we talked about how I have the onHovered here, okay? And you can see here that everything just works well as far as like the animation with the scaling, because these things are implicit there. And I have to this was a lot of things that we're exploring and working on, especially if you like animations. Another way to think about it is that this also allows us to define the styling one way and then reuse a styling for particular animations. And Lucas, which is one of the core maintainers, also makes it. He spent a lot of time kind of working through it, doing research, right? So almost like you have to become an expert in these inner workings of Flutter in order to do that. And I think we worked a lot on getting the API right in order to do that. So these will be something like implicit animations here and how they behave with things like on hover states, for example, right? And then,
so a couple questions here, if we can, yeah. So if you scroll up just a tiny bit, I want to look at this code base or look at that code snippet some more. So folks are pointing out in the chat that this is extremely reminiscent of the Flutter Animate package as well, just in terms of API. Don't know about whether or not the internals look similar or not, but just to make sure I'm understanding how this code works. So I'm going to read it top to bottom and just narrate my mental model of what's going on here. And then, please either interrupt me or correct me at the end. So we got the box styler, that's empty. Call color, so assign it a color, assign it a size, assign it a border radius. And then we give it a scale of 1, which is sounds like a no op. But then when we say on hover, now you give it some more some changes, right? So new color, new scale, and then the dot animate. And I guess what I'm wondering here is how can I intuitively go backwards and understand what is going to animate? You know, is it like maybe it's just actually as I'm saying this, I think you were just explaining this, and I'm just internalizing it slowly. But I guess what's happening underneath the hood here is that there's an animated container. Maybe when you call .animate, what you're saying is, no, this isn't it's not a regular container at the end of this box. It's an animated container, and the .spring gives it the curve. And so now all the things animate. Anything that changes animates. My first question was like, how many of the things are going to animate? And then as I was describing it, I realized, no, I think you were just saying this is an animated container at the end. So everything's going to animate. If anything changes, it will animate. Am I following it right?
Yeah, so I can actually dig in the code, but yeah, I want to make sure that get too much in the weeds, but as far as showing, so like I'll explain if you think if it works. If not, we can show like the inner workings of Mix. But one of the ways, like when we're doing the animates, when the styling detects that there's a animates, right? So what we're doing is we're actually creating almost like a generic implicit animation. So we're saying, okay, there's an animation, here are the configurations of it, and we're actually going to go ahead and build almost like this animation builder, if you will, and all the widget, the box is going to be under it, okay? And what we're doing is when you do on hover, you're switching the styles, right? So by having everything under this animation builder, we switch the style within the state, right? The stateful widget side of things, if you will, manage the state. We actually go ahead and animate those things correctly, meaning that, hey, we have this styling and we switch into this styling, and we're actually going to lerp through the resolved value. So what we're doing is that we resolve the styling value, and that's why we saw the lerp in different places. We have this resolved styling value, and when the person hovered, now we have this resolved styling value, right? So for example, the box styler, color, size, and so on. So imagine you have a box decoration and constraints and so on, right? So hey, we have these resolved properties here, and now we're gonna lerp in between them after they have been resolved. So yeah, it becomes again, it's very similar to theme extensions, because all we're doing, like theme extensions, they need to have the lerp in order to handle animation. Is we're just lerping in between them, and the animation allows us to just configure on how we want to switch between those two values. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that's exactly how an animated widget works. It does exactly that. So do you use animated widgets out of the core Flutter framework, or are you handling the lerping? Or are you managing that yourself?
No, so the only reason we don't use animated widgets is because first, well, there's not animated widgets for everything. And also we have things like the modifiers and so on, right? So actually we treat API, this, we're using the foundational widgets, but not the animated widget themselves, in order to just simplify how we're doing things. Now, one way to think about it is this. For example, the box styler resolves to a box spec, and a box spec is just like all the properties of the container, okay? And I can actually then pull it up to see what it looks like, the resolved value. Actually, when we have like create a widget, we can describe it. So essentially we say, hey, we have a spec value that is going to be resolved to, and then we have a styler on how we're going to define it, right? So everything is pretty much built upon this, and it allows us to actually have cache in different places, right? Because once I have the resolve value and the resolve value never changes, I don't even have to like rebuild it, or I can choose if I need to lerp or not, if they're different or not. So there are many different places that we can do that. And I can go into also, again, taking a little bit like of inspiration now from something like Swift UI. We have also other types of animations, and obviously people can create also their own types of animations. Do you want to get into this here to have an understanding?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think folks are very interested. There's more questions about animations and stacking animations. So yeah, let's get into it.
Yeah. So we wanted to create these. Okay, we wanted to have implicit animations, but also we wanted to be able to have, I'll say, like two different types of animations that will kind of, I don't know, maybe solve 80% or 70% of the custom animation cases, right? Um, and give a little bit of that control of it, right? So here is a phase animation, and again, if you've seen some of these things of UI, again, to give credit to Lucas, he comes from the Swift and Swift UI, so a lot of these things like understanding. And one thing that was interesting is that he started seeing how there's like a very similar paradigm about UI rendering in general, right? And we're actually taking a lot of the lessons from it in animation. So the phase animator pretty much is what we want to do is that when a value changes there, right, we have a trigger, we have the phases there, which is just the enum, okay? And all we're going to do is say, hey, we're not going to go implicit like just let's say on and off, but we're going to trigger a cycle to go through all the initial, compress, expand type of thing. And what we do there is that we have a style builder that allows us to essentially say, it passes the style there, and I can say how I want, which values of the style I want to override on which phase. Okay, so I actually can build upon that. So you can see here the initial, I have the scale 1, and this is something actually like we simplify resolve, but I think it kind of touched on becoming best practice, is that hey, if you're going to animate something like scale, you should always define a default scale value, right? And not just assume that it is going to be one. So we're doing like let's say defaults for this, but I think that's a good thing. So it pretty much through the style builder, it allows us to say how we want to override each part of the value there. And then we have a config builder. And what this does is, okay, here I want to define the style on each phase, but also here I want these things to animate differently. So essentially is I'm passing a different animation configuration based on the step itself, okay? So here you can see how it works. And we have the definition here, but now the good thing is that I can define the phase animation separately. I can bring the ball styling together there, right? I can actually like build upon this in many different ways. And it was interesting as going through it because a lot of the changes, and again, credit to Dart. The joke, and I think I say this joke all the time, is that like it seems like the Dart team is always reading my diary type of thing, because it just like they're always making like the decisions that like, yes, like it just fits really well, like the pattern matching and the return switch cases and the dot notation, right? From like all these things just makes a cleaner implementation. And if you had to build like a phased animation like this before, you can just imagine how complex you could get into as far as like breaking this down, right? And also it kind of goes, if you wanted to customize or change and tweak the animation, is actually very, even the configuration of how to animate and the styling, they become very separately on how we build these things, right? So you can see here. Yeah, let me know if I'm going too fast or if I'm not looking at the chat. So if any questions come up or things like that, we can touch on.
Yeah, no worries. I'm covering chat for you. I love this phase animation. Also, I literally just tabbed over and typed to the Dart team in the chat. It seems the Dart team is reading my diary.
Yeah.
Has feedback from you. What a quote. But I love this phase animation because as you just mentioned, building phased animations is crazy complicated. And really not terribly fun. One thing that I haven't worked out as I'm looking at this yet is where is the code that actually does the advancing through the different phases? You got that enum at the top,
So
And
it's the
then, like you
trigger.
mentioned,
So
it's a
phase animation
trigger.
accepts a value notifier.
Okay.
So pretty much is we pass a value notifier, and essentially it is once this value notifier changes, it triggers to go through the phases, right? By using the config builder of each phase as the timeline in a way, right?
Mm.
As it goes through. So this is just like a trigger, and it runs through the phase itself.
Okay. So, um, yeah, I wanna hang on this a little more because there is still some functionality here that I'm not fully able to spot.
Mhm.
So in the initial, well, in the beginning, it's going to be on the initial phase, which is also what you've named it. At least I'm presuming. So first of
Mhm.
all, is like just is the default initial value the enum that you pass in, like the first value? Because
Yes.
obviously, okay, so animation.values is a list of
It is.
the values on the enum. So okay, the first one is the default. So we're imagining this enum is chronological. When and how does it move into compress, and how does it know when compress is over and it's time to move into expanded? Because I actually don't quite see that.
Yeah. So this is how we are
Oh, so it's just the
defining the config
completion of
itself.
that animation. Okay.
Yeah. So pretty much it's saying, okay, here's where initial is, okay, and it's saying the configuration, and we're going to run through this style, and then after the completion of it, like you talked about, then we're gonna go through the next one, right? So for example, the interesting type of phase animation is that we're not defining how long the phase animation takes. The phase animation will take how long, well, the sum of all the phases together. Does that make
Mm-hmm.
sense? So, for example, because if you define a phase animation and then you're saying, okay, but you have like steps that act differently. So the phase animation is going to take the sum of all the phases, and it runs, uh, linearly, one after the other after completion.
I see. Yeah. This question was, chat was just asking the same question. So within that config builder, I mean, within the code that consumes the config builder, I'm guessing there's like at some point eventually there's an animation controller. And the first one
Correct.
is going to run for 800 milliseconds. And when the animation phase gets to completed or whatever the animation phase is called, then it's going to move to the next one. So then it moves to compress. And so it's just kind of within, yeah, just based on those animation controllers and the times that are passed in, it proceeds through all the things.
Yes.
Okay.
And that's
That
something I
makes
think
sense.
is, yeah, is behind the scenes. Is that one way to think about mix is it's just an abstraction of saying that, like, instructions saying how things should be resolved, right? So pretty much like through the API, you just defining the instructions on how you want them to be resolved. I think that's one way, the abstraction. But they're always going to be resolved to the widgets, using the, things like the animation controller, and so on, depending on the phase. There are some cases, I think, on the keyframe, for example, animations, and that's one thing that allows us to do is that these animations, they allows us to also optimize for the use cases, if you will. So I think that's one thing that is important to do that. But you can think of it, I have an animation config, and for example, the keyframe animation has a config that actually renders into a widget that's going to handle all those things like the animation controller and so on.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm curious to see. Oh wow, what a nice little that there's so much life in that animation, and coding that from scratch with your own animation controllers. If it's just like, all right, I'm writing a stateful widget here, and in my init state, I'm making an animation controller, and you want to create that effect, uh, not easy.
Yeah,
So it seems like a really nice API for it.
yeah, and so one thing also we want to do is that there's the key, which it gets a little bit more into complicated territory, which is you want to animate, which it's almost like separate tracks of the property in a way. So essentially, what you want to do is that, okay, I have properties that I want to animate, okay, but actually want to animate them differently, right? So essentially, this is addresses the problem of like, okay, I have a style and I can animate the style and I can animate the style through the phases. But what if I want to animate pieces of the style differently? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
When I click, I want the color to animate one way, but I want the scale to animate in a different way, right? So that's the case that you would use something like the keyframe animation, right? That pretty much is it allows to define and say, okay, here's the scale, here's the width, and actually define these things completely different, right? I'm actually defining how they do, like building the timeline and so on. And we actually set also the initial value that we want there. And you can see in the style builder, we actually just getting the value of the key that is there, so we can animate on the builder itself. And we're doing some optimizations in order to do that, because we do know what are the properties that and the values that are being used. So it pretty much allows us to essentially get the value at that time and choose how you want to adjust the styling. Does that make sense? So it's adjusting individual properties of the styling separately, having separate property, which I think was interesting because which that's one thing I love about Flutter, and it kind of goes into the composability, right, of the widgets, right? Because initially we're like, oh man, it'd be great if we just had like a great API for implicit animation. Then we did it, and then we're like, let's go phase, let's and we're like, oh, here's something in SwiftUI, like, oh man, let's do that. And then just like, hey, there's this case here that we wanted to build, and like, all right, let's do it. And it's just like getting great results because all the primitives are so solid, right? It's just amazing to be able to build things like that. So obviously, like, this is not a case for everyone. This is a very advanced case, but you can imagine how complex. I don't even think it'll be fair because I know there's different approaches and there's some packages that also handle these things. But this will be like a very complex approach of multiple animation controllers and so on that would have to be done.
So a couple things I want to point out about that code that were really striking me. As I was first reading it, I noticed the string values passed to keyframe track scale and width as just raw strings. I was like, whoa, that's really surprising. But then down in the style builder is where type safety actually starts to happen. So, you could put ASDF in the keyframe track and then you pull it out and apply it wherever you want in the style. Obviously, ASDF is always a bad choice. But I was like, are there accepted values? Like, how does this work? But no, you're just pulling out scale and then applying it to scale. And you're pulling out width and applying it to width down in the style builder. So that's interesting.
And I think it kind of goes into building the best practice, because what I'll suggest is we should do an enum if you want type safety. So I think it becomes a little bit cleaner, because it's still
you provide
string,
your own enum.
Typed, right?
You provide your own enum, like whatever you need for your app.
Correct. But then it allows us to make sure that that value does exist. So there's some things that we're kind of flushing those things out and make it cleaner on what type of values you want to pass and so on.
Yeah. A really good question just now. Is there a way to explicitly stop an animation like this programmatically? Like, let's say, when the user clicks, something happens, but then if they click again, it either needs to start over or change or, whatever.
So that's a great question. And I think let me see here if I have an example. So for example, there are a few things that, depending on the type of animation, I'm saying, okay, what happens if I interact it in between, right? So for example, here is the full animation, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So here, what happens
when you click it twice? Is it just stacking them? Is it queuing them? Does it start over? It's all happening so fast, I can't quite tell.
Yeah. So what it's doing is, the behavior is like, for example, let's say I'm midway on the animation. It actually goes into the midway back into what the null cycle is, right? So it doesn't cut off, meaning it flushes out the animation. What it does is it uses the remaining timeline to animate back into the initial step. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yep.
So
Yep.
just like imagine like a timeline, I go halfway, right? And then I press it. What it does is it animates back into the initial flow, if you will. Or
Okay.
else, because initially when we did is that we had an issue that it animates, but then when I press it again, it just like scale one again, right? Like hard stop, it wouldn't animate
Yeah, not good.
back into it. So there's not like a perfect, you can see here, like there's some cases where I can go ahead and, it still kind of flows through depending where I press, if I press too early, but you can see that it kind of, animates in different situations to kind of go through the whole cycle itself, right?
Yeah.
And also,
Okay, and I think you were about to. Oh, sorry,
Right.
say again.
No, if there's also a delay for people watching or things are working well.
Okay, I think you were about to get into another thing before I cut you off.
Yeah, so here's an example also of like a loop, right? So if you want an animation that just goes through it and loop itself, you can see how that might work throughout, if you will. And so you actually can define these things that are, going through it and we really try to work and build on top of the animation system, able to do that with the changes that were done on the styling itself. So I think animations was a big thing that we wanted to do and we wanted to focus on, and I think it showcases, because one thing that is interesting is that if going back to the modifiers, right? If I add an opacity or if I add like a clip or something like that, all those things animates. So it's almost like I have a snapshot of a widget tree that is being completely animated throughout, right? Let me see if I have an example here of, I think there's a good example here. We still don't have the short dot notation. But you can see here that what we're doing here is like, something like wrapping the opacity. So actually it's animating throughout the important pieces there, right? So there's a lot of different things that we had to take into consideration. We can think of it like as a styling, again, the instructions on how we want the tree to be rendered.
So we're probably coming up on time shortly here. So if there's a few more minutes of stuff that you think is valuable to walk people through, we could do that. And then I think it'll be about time to get to questions, or we could even just go to questions now and then give ourselves even more time for deeper answers to questions.
Yeah, if I can touch on two things that we're building towards, just like
Sure.
I'll touch on briefly, which is the GenUI side, and show like a project of that maybe showcases a different way to also think about mix. Okay, so one thing that we're doing here, we talked about these instructions, right? So one thing that we're building towards is essentially this mix schema, right? So you can think that, okay, so we created these instructions on how the widget tree is rendered, and what we can do is actually create a schema of the whole widget tree. And by having the instructions on how the widget tree can be rendered, it means also that now we can, it really opens up for GenUI and generated interfaces, if you will. Okay. So that's again, if you're curious, that's one thing that we kind of building towards, which is the schema of the widget tree, and kind of going through it. And you talked about how validation works and those things, and there's a lot of different things that we're touching on in order to do that. But you can think about the structure, right? So we have, because with the mix, we can actually create a schema of the widget tree, and opens up for a lot of different options and a lot of like complex charts that I think people love and so on. But if you played with GenUI, or if you've been exploring GenUI, and I think actually later I can, there's a few talks that I talked about GenUI, some of these problems and challenges they're trying to solve. But that's the main goal, is that, hey, I don't want to just pick in between widgets, but we want to get to the points that the AI can really essentially pick the widget tree that chooses to show you completely, right? From tokens and styling and even the animation itself. So that's something that we're doing. And a use case that we've done for this is, which is very much experimental, is mixed tailwinds, right? So what we did with mixed tailwinds is like, okay, we're building all this stuff. This is interesting. Can we have tailwinds classes? And again, this is not, I suggest that how you should build widgets. This is an experimental part just to test it out. But I think we're getting interesting results. Is, can we create something like a div and then we have the class names, right? And it's fully compatible with tailwinds, and it does all these things, the border and rounded and paddings and all these things that, like if you come from the web, you're probably going like, yes. If you're coming from like native Swift UI or Flutter, you're like, no. But we wanted to say like, okay, can we actually render these things, right? And that's one thing that allows us to do it, is building by leveraging mix. It allows us to create a almost like a parser using the mix schema from this. And it was actually much easier, like, because we spent so much time building these foundational things, like, okay, let's put it to the task, can this be done? And we're like, the results were really well done. And I actually have here, let me just get here one example, if you don't mind. Let me share my screen real quick.
An example would be great. Then after this, we'll get to some of the last unanswered questions. And then we can all go run pub install mix.
So for example, this is, I guess, like a more advanced concept. And again, it's still experimental with playing with it. And let me open up so here is a tailwinds. This is like real tailwinds, and this is mixed tailwinds. So the main goal is that we want the widget tree to be the same, meaning, okay, I want to do a div, I want to do an H1, the same, right? And I also want to add the tailwinds tags the same. So again, if you never worked with Flutter, if you look at the code, you're like, okay, I understand that it's tailwinds there, right? So, and this is the results that we're getting, and you can see even like the how responsive it is, how it works, using the same syntax as tailwinds. Now it kind of opens up to just like explore a lot of different cases. Obviously, there's a lot of tools doing tailwinds, right? And kind of like being trained for tailwinds. So now if you have a tailwinds feature, you can actually, okay, I want to bring this into Flutter. It does become a way. Now the reason is experimental is because we haven't really gotten to like real use cases, meaning states management, how these things are going to work internally, right? But we wanted to test out the just like painting the screen, right? Can we have tailwinds trees and actually paint the screen, being consistent? And the results are I think, speak for themselves. It's consistent. There are some things that we still want to elaborate and build upon in use cases, but I think that's one way to kind of going to mix. Okay, what is mix? And that's why it's like, okay, mix is a styling system, because sometimes it's tough to say like, okay, I want to use it to build a design system, or I want to run to build a abstraction and so on. So this is a package. There's very much experimental, if you will, but it kind of showcases where we think that Flutter could play an interesting role, which is I'll say like the instructions in the schema of a widget tree in Flutter.
That's a darn cool example. That's really neat. I have to say, you mentioned, if you come from the web, you're probably like, yeah. If you come from native, you're probably like, oh. Well, I come from the web. So I think that's an extremely cool demo. And obviously we lack the time for it at this particular moment, but I hope to find some time at some point to kind of read some of that code, look at the styles that were written, like compare them with the CSS. I think that'd be really fascinating. Okay. So there's a handful of questions that I think are good to get to here. Some of them are about mix. Some are the like decoupling questions that I mentioned earlier. Let's see. We've kind of hit that one. Oh, this one you mentioned. We did not get to it today. We did get to it on your first time on Observable Flutter. Is there a generator for this package? So I know there was in V1. I have to imagine there will be again in V2. What's the state of that?
Yeah, so that already exists, and I won't touch on, but like we're building a foundational design system called Remix, which essentially is we're kind of creating the properties of the main values that are there. Let me see if I can just build this in here. So so pretty much is I can define the spec, right? So for example, if I want a button that has a container, which is a flex box, and has an icon, and all these things are already defined, right? We have all these specs that we already created, these primitives. When we run the build runner, it actually builds all the styling, and like it builds all the primitives and all the pieces there, right? So if you just define the spec itself on how you want to do, right? So essentially, like you can think of it like a composite. Like, so a button has a flex and has a box and has an icon and has a text, right? But we have these specs. You define those things, and we can generate all the styling and APIs so we can reuse. So you don't have to manually create, 3, 4, 5 different things, and also actually brings in all the modifiers, things like the directives, variants, all already generated for you.
Incredible. That's great. Because there's a fair amount of code that goes into a full mix setup. So it's nice to write as little as possible. Okay, I'm looking at I'm trying to get all the mix questions out first. Okay, these other questions are pretty specific. Let me see how much there is to pull out of this at this point. How does Mix handle or optimize style overrides in deeply nested widgets, especially in responsive dynamic layouts? I think you hit this a bit when you were talking about different ways that Mix is opinionated around caching caching styles and detecting when there's changes and not rebuilding unless there are.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think a nice enhancement to the documentation would be kind of like do this, not that, when you're pointing out like, oh, if you wrote it this way, you'll cache bust every frame on accident.
Yeah.
Like that kind of stuff would be really helpful. Mm-hmm. But a great question. And last one here about kind of composing some of these things, where I think Randall had a comment about it in real time as well. Devkayo asks, I'm wondering if that could be a set of Mixin's extensions. So I think, oh gosh, at the moment I remembered what that was from this sentence. Since we're only applying styling, does that make sense? I think they're talking about composing different kind of chunks of a style, but forgetting exactly what that was from this is undermining my ability to answer the question a little bit. So I have failed on that.
So I think I have one example. So two things. So, and I don't know if this answered directly, but it maybe gives a little bit of the inner workings, if you will. So this is how essentially like what we do with the box, okay, if you will.
So this is okay. Great, you're making it bigger. Nice.
Yeah. So let's say the whole box styling, right? So this is actually the code, but I want to give it an example of like if you wanted to build an extension of the container, right? So we have the box mix, and you can just rename it container mix, if you will, which it pretty much says that every single property is fully mergeable and composable and resolvable. Now, however, the box spec is a one-to-one mapping of all the properties of container. right?
Mm.
So essentially, and that's what we're doing when we have the code generator is, hey, I'm gonna define a spec and it's gonna build the styling for it and resolves.
Mm.
And you can actually build like, okay, all I have to do is saying, hey, I have a type of style that I'm going to convert and turn into a spec. And you can choose to how you want to use the spec, right?
Yeah.
So for example, you could actually have the full API that we just discussed and overviewed as part of an extension method within the container. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah. And seeing this kind of code is super valuable, I think, for everyone to really map what's
Let me
going on
show.
here.
Yeah, if you don't mind showing just one more so people understand it. That we talked about the box decoration. I think that was an example.
Mm.
So the box decoration has a box decoration mix for the reasons I mentioned, right? Which it means that every single property needs to be fully composable and override, right? And that's one thing that Flutter has a lot of defaults in the classes they can override them. But one way to think about it is, okay, we have a mix and we define the value, right? The gradients, the radius, and so on. And we can just resolve it using the context. Okay. So essentially it means that we can use the API and build upon and resolve it, and everything just works. It just resolves into a decoration. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, this makes sense. So one thing I think would be great as V2, you've mentioned you're still kind of ironing out some details, and the generator is, if I caught what you just said a minute ago, kind of still in progress a little bit, or a little more work to be done there. I think it'd be great to have you back on in some amount of weeks when we can have a more hands-on time with Mix and show the intended developer journey. Like, this is what you write. Then you run the generator, so you don't write that. And then this is how you use it. And, kind of like build some of these custom things, maybe write an animation ourselves, write some interactivity, some hover states, and really get that stuff to sink in. I think that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to, once we have the 2.0 release, we can kind of go through and building a little design system, if you will, and what that looks like.
That would be awesome. I would love that. Okay. Well, that's for me, if nobody else, that is just an absolutely exciting idea for the future, and a promise to return to Mix. So there's a couple of questions in chat that I want to get to that don't have anything to do with Mix, and I promised that I would, in fact, answer these. So Showdev earlier, who's also been asking some very good questions of late, says, by the way, not a Mix question, what is the actual reason for decoupling Material and Cupertino from the Flutter framework? And just a wonderful question. And there's a lot, honestly. There's a lot of reasons. So I won't even be able to do justice to all the reasons this is happening, but the ones that I can remember off the top of my head. First and foremost, in my opinion, is the fact that for 6, 8, however old Flutter is, that many years now, for Flutter developers, when you update your Flutter SDK version, you get some surprise design changes. And so Flutter upgrade can imply suddenly your UI doesn't fit anymore because Material changed its thought, or a widget was using an old definition for Material, and someone finally got around to bumping it to the modern thing. And Material's like, yeah, that button should have a little more padding. And so now it doesn't fit in your UI anymore. And something clips, and it's like, oh goodness. Now you have to go through and sort out what Flutter changed so that your app just doesn't look any different. That's never been a fun experience. Nobody likes it. And once Material and Cupertino are outside of the framework, you'll be able to run Flutter upgrade and just get core things like engine improvements, embedding improvements, like native platform things, new APIs, additive widgets only. And then you can, if you're using Material and Cupertino, you decide for yourself when you bump those versions. And when you do that, you understand that you're signing up for some changes. And you can never do that if you don't want to. So that is an extraordinarily high value thing that, in my opinion, alone justifies the maneuver. Another thing that comes to mind is that it forces better, more cohesive logic to be refactored into the raw widgets layer. Earlier, I mentioned that in fact the material and Cupertino layers had themes, but the widget layer in Flutter didn't, and maybe still doesn't, but I believe it will soon. And there's a lot of that. There's a lot of widgets that have what you would think of as like not even really materially. They're just kind of table stakes for a UI platform, but maybe they have some behavior in them. And so they were only in the material and Cupertino libraries. And so if you wanted to use the widget library, you were reinventing that for yourself. So that's another thing. The widgets layer is going to become much, much stronger by doing this. There are others as well, but I think hopefully I've sold everyone who was either indifferent or skeptical that breaking out these libraries is going to be, also Material and Cupertino will be able to update way faster because they can just, they can bump the version of their package whenever they're ready to. A lot of times right now, there'll be a problem with a material widget and it gets fixed. And Flutter developers get their hands on it 2 months later for no reason at all, just because that's the release cadence of the Flutter SDK. And that's already a pretty fast release cadence for the Flutter SDK. So it couldn't really go any faster, but it's kind of painful to have to wait that long for a quick, a simple fix in a material widget. So a lot of these things like that, I think, are just going to deliver a tremendous amount of value to all of us. And I'm so excited. And I jumped up and down when I first read the internal proposal to do this, which is a while ago now, but I'm so excited. Leo, I'm sure you've thought a ton about breaking out Material and Cupertino and the implications of all that. Anything that you would add to my long rant that I just had?
No, I think so Mix, it tries not to use, and I think the Flutter team is doing a lot of things, for example, things like sometimes you want to use a color, which I think was part of the material package and things like that. So I don't think it impacts, actually makes Mix stronger because I think there's less dependencies on things around material. Flutter. So we can have a cleaner, just widget states. And I think it tells a much better story when someone is starting from scratch and they just wanted to, the first time you want to render something like a text, if you don't have a scaffold, you might get a weird output and so on, right? So resolving some of the initial experience of just I want to paint a container around, that has already improved a lot through the widget states and removing those things. And I know it's a big effort. So I think it makes a much stronger Mix.
Yeah, nice. I'm very happy to hear that your experience working on Mix is that this will improve Mix and not complicate it. I think that's a really great signal for the way they're approaching it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, last question. This one just kind of piqued my interest. We're officially over time here, but that's okay because we make the rules. This one really piqued my interest. Lawrence L. Moite something said, any chance we can get this, get Mix to tap into Impeller? And I think this is an interesting opportunity to kind of remind folks about the architecture of Flutter and point out where Mix sits in the stack and where Impeller sits in the stack and remind ourselves of the layers in between them. Because the short answer here is no. There's not going to be a direct way to get Mix to talk to Impeller or have the two systems be aware of each other. But I think it's valuable to know why. So if you remember, and if you don't remember, I've spent a lot of time on the Flutter team trying to advertise this information. So you could check out technical talks I've given, the lifecycle of a widget and the lifecycle of a render object. And then I think that will really clarify some of this stuff for anyone who's curious. But, widgets exist to produce render objects, and render objects exist to register drawing commands with a mysterious canvas thing, which is basically just a container for drawing commands. So, when you have a container with a sized box and a color, that's what the container adds. The sized box and the colored box add render objects, and those render objects add to the canvas the concept of 100 by 100 pixel space and the concept of a color to fill that space. And then all you have at that point at the end of the render object life is those concepts of the size and the space and whatever you wanted to draw. And then as Flutter drills further, right, into itself and continues to evaluate, you eventually get to impeller. But what impeller's job is to convert those drawing commands into shader invocations. And shader invocations actually visit every single pixel in your whole UI or the space that they're worried about and figure out what color the screen should show on that pixel. Like that's what a shader does. So the distance between mix, which is like declaring how a widget figures out its styling information, is separated from multiple layers from impeller. And anyway, I think that's kind of just fun information to know and think about.
One thing I'll add, Craig, just quickly, is that you talk about like the stack. Mix doesn't even create its own render objects. So right. All we do is use Flutter primitive widgets, right? So we're actually just translating the Flutter widgets you love. Like we're not rebuilding like, okay, this is what a container actually should look like and things like layout. And another thing I'll mention is that one thing that mixed in wins will probably never be able to support is negative margins. That's one thing that the web does a lot, right? Like negative offsets and so on. And that's one thing that Flutter is it works well in optimize. And I think that's one of the things that the trade-offs.
Randall points out Flutter Animate has a shader animation though, so there's a precedent. Yeah, in Flutter you can use a custom paint widget and supply the custom paint widget your own shader. And I have a Flutter build show episode on doing exactly this. And when you do that, you short circuit a lot of these layers. Because if you remember, widgets make render objects make drawing commands are passed to impeller, and impeller converts those drawing commands into shader invocations. But there is a way all the way up top to have a widget just be like, here's the shader. And then like everything in between is essentially a no-op. So yes, it is technically possible, but Mix's kind of whole thing is just this like really unopinionated, really abstract kind of pure way to define styling things. But you could actually, remember we saw some of those variants and that ends in a build method. So what that build method could do is add a custom painter, and that custom painter could be like, use this shader. So in that sense, you could certainly connect them. Leo, any final thoughts on your end before we finally sign off? A little over budget here.
Thank you so much for having me. And like you said, I think there's a lot to digest. Hopefully get people at least thinking about some of these opportunities there. And the way I see is that, we all want Flutter to succeed because we believe so much in the technology. And I think the I see is like seeing the community be able to fill in the gaps where we think things could be improved to allow more people to experience Flutter.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, folks. Well, that is going to do it for today. I haven't looked at my calendar in a while, so I forget who it is, but I'm 95% sure that I already have a guest scheduled for next week. So I certainly expect to be here. I think it's going to be a little bit before there's another interruption to your regularly scheduled programming. But that is it for today. So thanks so much, Leo. Thanks for joining. And
Thank you.
To everybody, yeah. Until next time, happy fluttering.